As always, it is a delight to be able to journey with you in this process of human development, spiritual growth, and intellectual stimulation. These conversations are led by Dr. Bruce Chilton, who is the Executive Director of the Institute of Advanced Theology at Bard. As we all know, Dr. Chilton is one of the preeminent biblical scholars in the world. His scholarly works are not only used at the college level, but at the seminary and rabbinical schools to train future spiritual leaders. We're delighted to have this partnership with the Jewish Federation of Dutchess County, and through studying together and learning together, we can deepen the bonds of the sacred that dwells in each one of us. With no further ado, Dr. Bruce Chilton.
So he's right here too. I don't know why he clicked that.
And what I'll do is I will mute everybody while Dr. Chilton is speaking. Oh, I think everybody, and then afterwards we can unmute and ask questions.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you very much indeed, Luis, for that kind introduction, and Karen, and both of you, because you may have observed we are a little bit scrambling today just for technological reasons. We were interrupted by bad connection a little while, so we're hoping that will sort itself out. Luis, before he left, was able to share the screen. I hope that everyone can see today's handout.
It's not yet on the screen if you're sharing it on this screen, but everybody did receive the handout. So
well, that's oh, you know what? I think he opened it, but then perhaps it's not actually. Now I'm driving myself into another glitch, which I didn't.
Do you want me to try and share my screen?
Oh, that would be good. And when you're doing that, I will try to get back to where I was so I can see people, because I do want to be able to see people.
There's a lot of nice faces out there. We hope you do.
Yeah, no, I don't, because all I see at the moment.
That is totally fine. I am going to share.
What's up? Could you just get me back to the Zoom? There we are. There we are. Excellent. Good. Now I'm good. Thank you so much, Karen. That's great. So if you don't mind, Karen, when it comes to it, I'll just ask you to scroll down the document, but I'll do a intro first. I wanted to pick up on the fact that we were interrupted to speak of interruption. You'll remember last time when we discussed the extraordinary contribution of Inés Esteban. What made it remarkable was the intervention of the Spanish Inquisition, the attempt so to control the practice of religion in Spain that not only were practitioners of Judaism and Islam expelled from Spain, but also those who were converted to Christianity were pursued as being heretics if they continued in any way the practice of Judaism. This was the reason for which ultimately Inés Esteban was executed and why her life ended after so short a period of time. One of the characteristics of the Inquisition became a characteristic of totalitarian states after that time. Indeed, I thought of the Inquisition when looking at a consideration of certain policies which are followed today in China, namely looking for people deliberately who are deemed to be heretics. The issue is not just people who come forward with ideas which are radical, but people who can be pursued for the very suspicion that they would harbor heretical thoughts. And in the context of the Spanish Inquisition, Judaism itself was held to be a form of heresy. You'll see today that that had a surprising result. Surprising because it actually wound up enhancing something that Inés Esteban had pioneered in her time. You'll remember that Spain, in the time leading up to the Inquisition, had seen the development of the movement in Judaism called the Kabbalah, namely the tradition of the idea that it is possible for a human being to have contact with God, that God will reveal God's self to the human being, and indeed that he wishes to do that. We saw, and for those who need to be refreshed, you could look back at the recording if you like to, we saw that there are certain elements within the very brief evidence we have of the prophecy of Ines that she was influenced by that tradition. We're going to see that tradition much more directly reflected today in two thinkers, one Jewish, where we might expect to find it, and in another case, a famous Christian mystic, where you might not expect to find it. So let's take ourselves a few years after the time of Ines, and therefore into the 16th century. That brings us to our first woman of faith, namely Francesa Sarah of Safed. Karen, if you can just scroll down to that paragraph, there we are.
You mean this one?
Yes, that's right. And a little bit further down would be fine. Fantastic, thank you so much. And she lives in a town, as you can see, called Safed. She's nowhere near Spain, though her background is Spanish. She's living in Galilee. Why is she in Galilee in the 16th century? Well, the response to persecution is not only conversion, that's something one can do in the face of persecution. Many people have in many settings. But another possibility is to go into exile, to leave. And that resulted in the development of a small village called Safed in Galilee, within the historic territory of Israel, which became a major center of the practice of the Kabbalah in the 16th century and thereafter. Its great, well-known pioneer was named Isaac Luria. He came to be called in his Kabbalistic movement, the Lion. And so you'll see that the document I'm quoting from here today for Francesca is called Toldot Ha'ari, namely Generations of the Lion. The idea is that there were people who followed the teaching of Isaac Luria and his development of the Kabbalah, and this book is the development of that theme. The result is that Francesa emerges as one of very, very few women who are mentioned in this literature. On the whole, it has to be said that the practice of the Kabbalah was a male preserve. And that was always true, except when it wasn't true. And Francesa is an example of one of these extraordinary exceptions. You can ask the question, why Safed? Why are they running away from Spain to territorial Israel? And we'll see that's very important in her mind in one of the stories we're coming to. And the answer is, when the Ottoman Empire took over the area.
Did you get it?
Oh, excuse me, does someone have a question or comment?
No, I think some people have had a little bit of challenge getting on, so I'm trying to make sure that they're all getting on, and I think they were just confirming each other that they got on, so.
I understand, well, that's fine, that's fine.
Can you hear?
And so the Ottoman Empire had actually taken over the entire area from 1516.
Okay. You hear him? I was talking on mine. Yep.
And the Ottomans were distinguished for the fact that they permitted religious pluralism. That is, not only Muslims settled, but also Christians and Jews settled throughout this area. And it resulted in a flowering of a diversity of religious tradition. It's a situation we may very well consider nowadays when Islam is seen as being an inherently intolerant religion. Proof of the matter is that under Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans actually were able to promote an enormous amount of diversity, and they saw it as being consistent with their practice of Islam. So Safed in Galilee was a place where those who practiced the Kabbalah, that tradition of Judaism, could settle. They could do business. They were especially reputed in the area of textiles, and develop the tradition of the Kabbalah to such an extent that it is known as being a particular flowering of the entire tradition. Within this tradition, as I said earlier, the conception was that because human beings are made in the image and likeness of God, God really wants to communicate God's self to the human being. And he does so by means of energies that come out from him. And especially in Safed, under the influence of Isaac Luria, these energies that come from God were often conceived as being angels. And the conception emerged that one of these angels could be a guide for a human being. And such an angelic guide was called a Magid. And the idea was that Francesa Sarah of Safed had such a Magid that permitted her to speak to her community of their relationship to God and of what their personal fate might be. I find her a very interesting contributor because she truly acts in pastoral terms, not only in prophetic terms. As we'll see in the two examples I've selected, incidentally, this burns out most of the evidence about Francesca because not much is recorded. The fact that she was a woman was obviously held against her. So we have many fewer stories from her than we do from other practitioners of the Kabbalah. In the first case, that first quote, the setting is that in Safed, Francesca was worried that there was going to be a plague. Her Magid, her angelic guide, told her there was a danger of plague. And so she convened the community in order to call a fast for the purposes of prayer. You may remember that this was also a feature of what Ines taught, that fasting and prayer went together for the sake of concentration. And when they were brought together, the result was a greater communion with God. Well, she successfully did that. The community went into its fast, and there was no plague. But in association with that, one of the rabbis of the Kabbalah came to visit, and Francesca said of him, "Behold, now I know that he is a holy man of God, of whom the Lord has said, I will be sanctified by those close to me." They're quoting from the book of Leviticus. And that quotation of Leviticus is to speak of the death of figures. And so Francesca was prophesying the death of this rabbi, which actually came to pass. And it was this kind of insight for which she became especially well known. Now, the second case is also involved in that kind of personal or pastoral prophecy, but fortunately, it's more detailed. So Karen, perhaps you can just go down the page a little bit, about 3 long. Oh, I see, there's a break there. I take it back. If you go back to where we were, we'll do that page and then the next page. So in this case, one of the rabbis of Safed announced that he wanted to go, because after all, they're all doing business as well as practicing the Kabbalah, right? He announced that he wanted to go to Turkey to meet up with a businessman there in order to further his commercial interests. Then Francesa Sarah had told him, no, you shouldn't do that because the Lord doesn't approve what you're doing. He then shows up on another occasion on the next day, and she says to him, "Hear now the word of the Lord. The man whom you seek is certainly dead, but should you desire to go, the Lord will make your journey successful." Then he says, "Yesterday you told me not to go, since I would not succeed, and now you tell me to go, for the Lord will make my journey successful." Her response is really quite fascinating. She says, "That is true. Yesterday, you thought to leave the land of Israel and dwell abroad, while last night you repented and made the Lord your witness that if he grants you success, you will return to Safed. Since the will of the Lord is that you not uproot your home from the land of Israel, he will grant you success." Now, what's stunning about that statement is not only Francesa's insight to what is going on with this person, which turns out to have been accurate, but also that she introduces the place of the land of Israel as a place of communion with God. This is centuries before there's a Zionist movement. It has not yet been developed. And you'll notice that she has no ounce of political calculation in the particular attachment to the land of Israel that she's talking about. Rather, she's attached to the land as the place where this communion with the divine can take place. And so, Karen, if you'll just go down a little bit to the next page, upon hearing the words of the woman, he fell flat on the ground and bowed in worship to the Lord for having given this wisdom to this woman of valor. From then on, faith in her was fixed like a trusty stake, and he believed her, and she said many different things. Alas, the chronicler didn't see fit to tell us these different things that she said in any kind of fullness. But what we can see is that in her own time, she is actually a more influential figure than the remains in literature make out, because she combines this idea with a Kabbalistic communion of God with attachment to the land of Israel, and also discernment of how each individual can work out the relationship to the land and at the same time to the divine. So I must say, I find her quite a fascinating development for early on in the 16th century. Because of the background of Safed, I think that her connection with the Kabbalah is perfectly understandable. That much is straightforward. What's unusual is her own accomplishment in this, given the fact that the Kabbalah was certainly biased towards the practitioners who were male rather than female. But a place where one might not expect to find anything in the Kabbalah, one also finds, namely back in Spain, in Theresa of Avila, one of the most famous mystics of the Christian tradition, also from the 16th century, and also someone influenced by this tradition of what I referred to earlier, namely the conversos, those who converted.
Dr. Chilton, quick
Yes.
question. Do you
Yes, go
want
right
to have all questions at the end, or would you like to field questions when they come? Arlene raised her digital hand for questions, so just so that way we follow whatever you prefer. Just
Well,
as-
you know, if one has arisen now and it's because it's about Francesa, it's probably better not to wait, right? Yeah, perhaps we can deal with it, and then we'll move on to Theresa.
Okay, I'm going to do my question then.
Good.
I understood that the Kabbalah was only studied by men. So how did Francesca get knowledge of the Kabbalah? So yeah, that's my question.
That's very good. It's an excellent question, and it applies also in the case of Ines from last week, in that whether in Spain or in Safed, the understanding was the practitioners are all male in the sense that they will actually leave home for the purposes of meditation and then return home. But they did in fact return home. They did speak of what they had learned. There was a oral tradition of the Kabbalah as well as a written tradition. In fact, in the case of Ines, it had to be oral for her to know anything about it, since she was illiterate. She did not have a background that permitted her to read. So the awareness with the Kabbalah on the part of Ines, then Francesca, and now we're just coming up to Theresa, would be entirely on the basis of oral knowledge. But something to bear in mind is that the most basic aspect of the Kabbalah is not particularly complicated. It's just radical. It goes back to this notion that I referred to earlier on, namely that the nature of God is an image and likeness which is comparable to the image and likeness of a person. The book of Genesis says that. So the idea was that these energies that come from God will to be revealed in human beings. And also, and this perhaps is the most radical aspect of the Kabbalah, also because human beings are made in the image of God, that means that you can actually speak of the body of God, just as you can speak of a body of a human being. God is understood to have a form, to have a shape. And one of the disciplines of the Kabbalah, in fact, is to meditate on the nature of the body of God. And the interest in doing that is so that one's own body becomes a focus of what you're attuning yourself to, namely the invisible, but nonetheless powerful body of God.
Bruce, I just finished a 4-week study with on the Kabbalah, and I understand that to say the word God is the concept you're talking about. But God is more than that. God is more than that. It's an energy that's more than what you call God and what you perceive God to be. So that to me was a very interesting concept. And so I can see where she could fit in to this kind of understanding.
Exactly. She can sit into it. And you're quite right. Within the Kabbalah, it is typical to refer to the very center of God, not as God, but rather as Ein Sof. That is, not having a limit, or we might say the infinite. One of the characteristics of the Kabbalah is that it invented a fresh language for God. At first blush, this can make the Kabbalah seem extremely complicated, just because they're using new language to refer to what are corresponding concepts in ordinary discussion. So, for example, I think myself that Ein Sof is the correspondent of God. That's the way they respond to having to designate God. So yes, it invites a different way of thinking about God, which any good mystical teaching should do, right? It should both make it seem rather out of the ordinary in order to awaken interest, and yet it has to be attached enough to the way that people use speech commonly that people can actually put it into practice. So I suggest that both Ines and Francesa are examples of the way in which it could be practiced, even on the margins of the meditation halls, where the official part of the movement was taking place. Now, Theresa of Avila, the Christian correspondent of Francesca, doesn't have to worry about not being a professional because she is a professional, right? She is a nun like Hildegard of Bingen, whom we have also discussed. As I mentioned, her father was himself a member of the Conversos, those who had moved from Judaism into the practice of Christianity. And this had resulted in the fact that Teresa's father had fallen afoul of the Inquisition too. He had to purge his reputation and did so. And indeed, Teresa herself was from time to time accused of heresy by authorities in Spain during her lifetime. By the way, after she died, she got her own back because she was not only declared a saint, but many people wanted her to be proclaimed the patron saint of Spain. That didn't work out. James, son of Zebedee, won. But the very fact that she was considered shows the extraordinary esteem in which she was held, primarily because of a book she wrote. She was in a position to write a book. Right? This is a major difference from Francesa. You can write the book, like Hildegard of Bingen, have it preserved. And there are many writings associated with Teresa. Her most famous work, completed only shortly before she died, was entitled, by the short title, The Interior Castle. But it's actually important to bear in mind the full title she gave this work, which is The Interior Castle or the Mansions. Why is she talking about the mansions? This is because she is thinking of the passage in the Gospel according to John, chapter 14, where Jesus says, "My Father's house has many mansions." She wants to talk about the way in which it is possible, by means of meditation, to inhabit the mansions of God, to investigate God's nature, and to meet there aspects of one's own nature. That, I believe, is a fundamentally important orientation for the understanding of Teresa. Otherwise, it is easy, all too easy, because I'm afraid many scholars do it, all too easy to imagine when she talks of the interior castle, she simply means the soul. She doesn't. She actually means the soul's interaction with God, a coming to know of God. And so I give just one example of this as a brief excerpt, but it's one which provides an orientation with the way in which she sees the entire meditated life, which is the activity that she had devoted herself to for as long as she had been an adult, through various accusations of heresy and controversies within her own rule. She writes, "A soul which gives itself to prayer, either much or little, should on no account be kept within narrow bounds. Since God has given it such great dignity, permit it to wander at will through the rooms of the castle, from the lowest to the highest." So you notice it's the soul that's roaming. It's not the soul which is the place. The soul is going through the place, through the mansions of God. Let it not force itself to remain very long in the same mansion. It's a very interesting view of meditation, a view of meditation that says, don't be boring. Don't always stop in the same place. Let it not force itself to remain for very long in the same mansion, even that of self-knowledge. Mark well, however, that self-knowledge is indispensable, even for those whom God takes to dwell in the same mansion with himself. Nothing else, however elevated, perfects the soul, which must never seek to forget its own nothingness. But let humility be always at work, like the bee at the honeycomb, or all will be lost. Interesting metaphor. Humility is not simply a sense of oneself as inadequate, but it's actually an exercise. It's a constant revision of oneself. Let humility be always at work like the bee at the honeycomb, or else all will be lost. But remember, the bee leaves its hive to fly in search of flowers, and the soul should sometimes cease thinking of itself, to rise in meditation on the grandeur and majesty of its God. It will learn its own baseness better thus than by self-contemplation, and be freer from the reptiles which enter the first room where self-knowledge is acquired. Although it is a great grace from God to practice self-examination, yet too much of it is as bad as too little, as they say. Believe me, by God's help, we shall advance more by contemplating the divinity than by keeping our eyes fixed on ourselves, poor creatures of earth that we are. So I think you could say that she was the first person to give the advice, get over yourself, and that she did so speaking specifically to contemplatives, that is, to people who were professionally engaged in meditation, in order to insist that really the interior castle is not the soul. The soul has to learn to free itself. Knowing about yourself is obviously vital. She openly says that. But unless self-knowledge is used to get beyond oneself, then its purpose is lost, because the investigation is to how the mansions of God can be investigated in order to develop an encounter with God. One of the features of her life, which won her both a great deal of praise and at the same time enormous opposition and criticism as a heretic, is that Theresa of Avila once said that for a period of 2 years, Christ was constantly with her. And this idea of Christ being with her resulted in scandal in her time and in later time. I don't know of any saint who has been as sexualized as Theresa of Avila, because she spoke of the bodily presence of Christ with her. And she describes this presence as being invisible and yet palpable. But what she is referring to, of course, is a meeting with Christ within the interior castle to which she refers. It is as if Christ, in the experience of Theresa of Avila, corresponds to the place of the Magid, the angelic energy from God, in the understanding of Francesa Sarah. So I think in both places, what we can see is a repressed tradition of the encounter with God, which came from the Kabbalah during the late Middle Ages, peaked itself just over the parapet in the case that we saw last time of Ines Esteban, but then becomes really quite forceful in the two 16th century cases of Francesa Sarah of Safed and also Theresa of Avila. And it turns out that what is usually seen as an all-male preserve, namely mysticism, is nicely broken both on the Judaic side and also on the Christian side. So I hope you find that helpful. I must say, I find these two figures extremely interesting, and they bring us into a framework of history which often is not discussed in the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. So I'm glad we've done this series. It's brought us into periods of time that have taught me a great deal. I think I see a hand from Arlene.
Yeah, here I go again.
No, that's great. I love those hands.
I'm thinking that both of these women were talking about union with God. It was a unitive experience. Although with Theresa, to say for 2 years, that's like, I don't know how a human being could withstand that kind of. Usually, it's a fleeting experience, not one that lasts for 2 years.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think this is her claim of that extensive time is one of the reasons for which she drew attention to herself, both positive and negative. But here I would call attention to an aspect of the practice of prayer within the Orthodox Christian tradition during this time, which we know was influencing most of monastic Christianity in the West, namely the practice of the presence of God by means of the Jesus prayer. That is the idea that in the course of meditation, in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, meditation is usually done on the basis of the Psalms, of memorizing the Psalms and then constantly repeating them during the course of the day, interspersed with a prayer that calls on Jesus himself. And the conception of this, that by repeating this prayer of Jesus, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, have mercy on me, a sinner, Christ will come more and more into the presence of the person. So much so that one will know Christ as someone who is constantly releasing from sin, which is a regular condition, not just a sporadic one in the understanding of Orthodox Christianity. So I think there, because Theresa is very concerned with the issues of fasting, incidentally, the way Francesa and Ines also were, fasting and prayer, repentance, because they become important, knowing the presence of Christ by means of constant forgiveness is, I think, understandable in her case. But nonetheless, having said that, I think it is true. Often mystical tradition is associated with the simple flash of insight. And that's more the case, as we saw with Hildegard of Bingen.
Seems like you've informed everybody very well. It's a quiet group today of questions. Maybe it's the Kabbalistic spiritualness that we're all just sharing information together.
That could be. It could be the Kabbalah. It could be the mysticism. Yeah, that's right. It might be a touch of spring too.
Yeah,
All of these
spring
things have their influence. Yeah. Someone has an actual hand raised.
Patricia and Abby.
And Abby, yeah.
Reverend Clinton, it's such a pleasure to hear you again. I've heard you in years past, but what I wanted to say was that I know of an individual, a man, who said he had a lucid dream with Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never had a lucid dream, but I was impressed by his story, because he said, first of all, that Jesus looked like he actually had looked in life. And that I guess he mentally asked Jesus, what's it all about? And Jesus answered, love and acceptance. Now, I'm wondering if any of these saints you're talking about might have had that kind of experience.
Yeah, this is a very good question. And I think there's no doubt but that lucid dreaming is an important part of the tradition of prayer and fasting, and is one of the reasons for which they're practiced. That is, the fasting is not for its own sake. Fasting is not a dietary exercise in this tradition, but it is an exercise for quiet contemplation. The idea is that it reduces the total number of distractions that you have, and also results in an integration of the way in which it is possible for us to confront reality in the dream state and the way in which we confront reality in the waking state. What if you combine the two? The concept is each becomes stronger, neither becomes weaker. So that in most cases of records of people involved in the life of prayer, a report of lucid dreaming will emerge in one shape or another. It is a very interesting state because being awake, one can actually remember what one is experiencing. But insofar as you're talking about a dream state, the imagination is more actively involved. And of course, is much more, typically, it is much more visual. May well have an auditory aspect, as in the case that you have just described. But what seizes the imagination ordinarily is the visual aspect. And of course, we have biblical examples of this, where prophecy is actually a matter of dreaming, lucid dreaming, and the interpretation of the dream. And when it emerges, that interpretation is actually as important as the dream itself. I mean, the most basic question of interpretation is, can I trust this lucid dream? I mean, I've had it, but does it in fact arise from a good place? Or is it like other dreams that we all know that we can have, which are simple wish fulfillment? I mean, that's what makes us, right, sometimes, to say the least, cautious about our own dreams. But dreams can also be assessed in such a way that they can become extraordinarily enriching. So I think that this is an aspect of what we're talking about. As far as I have seen within the literature, lucid dreams are always carefully assessed, because in that regard, the step of discernment, of seeing what is going on in that case, is at least as important as the content of the lucid dream itself.
Can I ask a question? Can you hear me?
Cantor Bob, of course you can. How are you?
Okay, happy Pesach and happy Easter.
Indeed, I've missed you during the season.
I too, I missed you. Does Theresa in her writings refer to her own Jewish background in any way, or speak about her father?
Right. She does speak of her parents. She does not refer to her Jewish background because she wants to stay alive. Because, you know, the Spanish Inquisition, despite Monty Python was no joke. I mean, in many ways, the Spanish Inquisition is the pioneer of the police state. The place where that totalitarian model forcefully comes out. The notion that you need to control thought in order to control identity, and both thought and identity are part of the province of the state. The Spanish Inquisition attempted to enforce that. And what's important is vitally important for us, of course, in North America and South America, because this is just the same period when the Spanish culture that influenced us was being exported. So it did not do helpful things for many, many understandings of government
Right.
throughout the world. I mean, when you're in a position where the Ottoman Empire is without question enlightened as compared to what was happening in Spain or Portugal or France or England, right? I mean, all these people are expelling Jews. The Ottoman Empire is not only accepting them, but permitting them to flourish and to develop their own traditions. The Ottoman Empire, paradoxically, comes to prefer to have Christians in their civil service on the grounds that then they would not be involved in religious disputes going on within Islam. So it became a remarkably successful empire to a large extent on the basis of diversity. I'm not saying for a moment it was democratic, it clearly was not, or that it was gentle, also again, not. But it did remarkably well, for example, in managing to administer that part of the Middle East that included ancient Israel until the First World War. So it was a remarkable success story.
Thank you.
There were
My
two
pleasure.
comments. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Please go right ahead.
No, I was just going to say there were two comments to share. One of them was, I think this is very sweet and tender and adorable. Cantor Bob, Luis says that he says hello and that you are one of his heroes. So I wanted to share that. He loves you, and
He's
I
one of
wanted to
mine.
share that.
He's one of mine.
Oh, there you go. Also, Susan shared a comment that in her experience, dreaming is like moving through Theresa's mansion.
Oh, that's really very interesting, Susan, I must say, because I think it's a great analogy. One of the descriptions that Theresa has of the mansions, the interior castle, is it is made out of crystal. And when she said that, it struck me because this corresponds to the way in which the heavenly halls, the halls around the throne of God, are described in the first book of Enoch. And you may remember last time that we spoke about first Enoch as one of the influences on Ines Esteban. This idea that God in heaven has an entire alternative reality, which is no less real than the reality you can perceive. In fact, it's more real than the reality you perceive, because the reality you perceive at the moment, we all know, is a fleeting reality, which is not going to last. Whereas the reality that is associated with God is entirely durable. So crystal becomes a metaphor for the permanency of the divine reality. It's true in Theresa, it's true in Ines Esteban, it's true in the first book of Enoch. For readers of the Revelation to John, the Apocalypse, you may remember the crystal sea, which is before the throne of God. All of these are ways of visualizing the complete durability and permanence of the divine realm. And I think they are an indication of an enduring tradition, which managed during the course of the Middle Ages to migrate from the Spanish Kabbalah, from before Ines, through her to Francesa, Theresa of Avila, and of course to continue thriving. It's ancient and it's modern at the same time. One of the challenges for anyone who deals with this tradition of literature, one of the challenges is to understand how much, when you're dealing with a given account, how much is the person speaking developing tradition, which is handed on, and how much is the person speaking developing on the basis of experience. Tradition and experience, the living and the past, are deliberately fused together in the mystical insight, so that disentangling one from the other is at best difficult, and sometimes you simply can't do it. There are, I think, moments when you have to acknowledge this is what the person said as a matter of experience. It also corresponds to tradition. That's as much as I can say.
Marion has a question. Marion, would you like to ask it, or would you like me to read the chat?
In regard to Francesca Sarah, I wanted to know anything else more in depth about her teachings. In addition to the fact that she felt that one could were in Israel.
Okay, Marion, I just didn't hear part of what you said because of the glitchy line. You said apart from the fact, and then I couldn't quite hear what you said.
That to commune with God, that you should come to Israel in order to commune with God. And
Okay.
what else? Is there anything else we know? I know you said really it was all, most of what she said was lost, but
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. She does represent the form of the Kabbalah that flowered especially in Safed. And it is interesting because Kabbalah can often appear to be quite abstract, when you speak about energy coming to God, even if you think of God as embodied and human beings as embodied. Nonetheless, Kabbalah will often appear to those who read the work not to be much a matter of lived experience. This was not the case at all in Safed, and I think to some extent it's because it was an entire community. It wasn't just a few expert practitioners, as has usually been the case in the history of Kabbalah. And incidentally, I also think this is why the prominence of Francesca leaked out. That is that I suspect there are other women about whom similar stories were told in centers other than Safed, but in Safed, you couldn't ignore her. And therefore, even though the bias towards Isaac Luria and other males remains, stories about her came out. And so I'd like to offer some further context about her emphasis upon Israel, because as I said, this is actually an important step on the way to a Zionist understanding of Judaism, although Zionism as a term has not been invented yet. And the reason for it in the understanding of Francesa and Safed generally is that it's understood that when you are physically closer to those in the present and those in the past who have practiced union with God, you yourself are more ready for that union. So that you should deliberately live in a community such as Safed. It is going to awaken your capability. It's a very interesting act of resistance to move to Safed and to insist you stay in Safed, because in effect you're saying our community has a wisdom that enhances you, and its physical proximity makes you stronger at the act of meditation. Associated with this is the idea of the Magid itself, to which I referred. And one of the reasons that she has stories told about her that while other women do not, is that the endowment with a Magid, of an angelic guide, was held to be something that only occurred to a very few extremely accomplished practitioners of the Kabbalah, with the assumption that they would all be male. And then up comes Francesa, who speaks on the basis of what a Magid told her. And it's clear also that I spoke earlier about the necessity of interpretation when you're dealing with lucid dreaming. Well, it's like important when you're dealing with angelic guides too, right? I mean, the issue is the angel really an angel? You know, is it something that represents the divine side? Have I deluded myself? Is this rather an evil influence? Exorcism was often practiced at Safed. It's part of its practical side. The idea that you have to deal with evil inclinations in people as well as the good. So for someone to be reputed to have a Magid means they have tested this. They have looked at the question, is this claim of angelic inspiration authentic, or is it deriving from self-delusion or something worse? She passed right through that. And that, more than anything else, is the basis on which these stories, though there are few in number, are told about her at all.
Yeah, that's what I find most radical, is that the men believed her.
Yeah, exactly. As in that story, that, you know, the guy makes his journey to Turkey, does better at it, makes his money, comes back, and listens to what she tells him thereafter, right? It's interesting, because she has a Magid, because she has a guide, she becomes a guide to the community. It's also interesting that she says, you know, if we don't fast, we're going to have a plague. And they fast. We could use her around to tell certain people to wear masks, you know.
I have a question.
Please, yeah.
The image that Theresa uses of a crystal is an interesting image because a crystal reflects many, many different facets.
Mm-hmm.
And if this is the many facets of God, you know, you have only one little piece of it, but there's so much more to it. And to me, that kind of reminds me of the Kabbalah, with this understanding of the reality of God being greater than what you can see God to be, and it, you know, the bodily form or the word that you give to God. It's even more. So to me, that's also Kabbalistic.
I think that there is a tie in there, and also with her notion that sometimes she says there are 7 rooms in the mansion. 7 rooms. Well, of course she'd say 7, right? Because if you're a Catholic in this period, you can't get your mind beyond 7, right? 7 deadly sins, 7 cardinal virtues, and so forth. But then she goes on to say, actually, no, there are many, many more rooms than that. So you have this notion of constantly having to investigate further in order to remain faithful to the act of meditation. So that meditation is not a limiting of one's attention. In fact, it's the very reverse. If it's limited, it can't be that it is authentic. Actually, Karen, we can't quite hear you.
I know. I'm laughing. I'm just like sitting here going, I pulled a rookie mistake. Lips moving. No, my children probably would love that mute. But anyway, I think all of our questions have been asked and answered, and we really value that and appreciate that. So thank you.
And I appreciate the questions. They've been wonderful, I must say. Thank you.
So it's hard to believe this is the 3rd of a 4th series, but we have one more to go, which is on May 16th. So we hope you will join us for that. Same time, same bat station, same bat channel, covering, I know Eleanor Roosevelt, and I'm blanking out on how to say the other person's name because she's a powerhouse in herself.
Yeah, right.
So anyway, we thank you all on behalf of the Rhinebeck Reformed Church, on behalf of Jewish Federation of Dutchess County. We thank you, Dr. Chilton, for joining us. We thank you, everybody here who has joined us. Remember to save the date for June 6th. We welcome you all to our next movie night in, which is going to be on a Wednesday versus a Thursday night. For those of you who pay attention to when we have our movie nights, it's actually going to be on the 28th, and we are showing A Spy Behind Home Plate about Mo Berg, and we have the award-winning director Aviva Kempner who will be joining us and answering questions. So please feel free to join us for that. And lastly, our next, since I shared with you our last Mitzvah Now project, our coming up Mitzvah Now project for May is going to be cereal counts. We're going to be collecting boxes of cereal and I think boxed milk, because cereal without milk isn't as good. Then we're going to collect it in the month of May, and we're going to distribute it to food banks throughout Dutchess County. So we will send more information about that. But on that happy note, happy April, everybody. Enjoy the blooming flowers, and hopefully nobody has too many allergies. And we look forward to seeing you next month in May. So have a good weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.